Population control, policy, or paranoia. Overpopulation has been called one of the greatest threats to humanity. But who decided that and why? Today we're unpacking the facts about population control, the policies, the players, and the patterns, without the drama and without the conspiracy. It began with Thomas Malthus in the late 1700s, who believed unchecked population growth would outpace food production. His theory would go on to influence major institutions, public policy, and even the ethical foundations of global development strategy. Thomas Malthus was an English economist and demographer best known for his theory that population growth would always tend to outrun the food supply. His work, An Essay on the Principle of Population, published in 1798, argued that an increase in a nation's food production would improve the well-being of the population, but this improvement was temporary due to the population's tendency to grow until the lower class suffered hardship, want, and greater susceptibility to war, famine, and disease. Malthus's theories have been influential in the fields of political economy and demography, and he is often referred to as the father of population theory. Fast forward to the 20th century, and population control moved from theory to action. In 1974, the U.S. government commissioned National Security Study Memorandum 200, led by Henry Kissinger, citing population growth in the developing world as a potential threat to U.S. interests. The goals and objectives of NSA 200 were to address the implications of worldwide population growth for U.S. security and overseas interests. The document aimed to 1. Encourage human population planning to slow down global population growth in rapidly growing populations of least developed countries. 2. Assist least developed countries in curbing population growth rates to prevent political instability and ensure stable food and resource supplies for industrial countries. 3. Promote U.S. economic stability by ensuring a steady flow of minerals and other resources from least developed countries to the U.S. economy. 4. Support the UN Population Plan of Action and a global target of replacement fertility levels by the year 2000. 5. Engage developing countries and the political leaders in efforts to moderate population growth. NSSM 200's goals were to work closely with other nations rather than impose U.S. views on them, emphasizing the importance of international cooperation and population control efforts. Margaret Sanger and her role in birth control. Margaret Sanger was the founder of the birth control movement in the United States and a prominent international figure in reproductive rights. She is widely credited with coining the term birth control and played a pivotal role in promoting contraceptive access during a time when such discussions were considered taboo. However, her legacy is deeply entangled with the early 20th century eugenics movement, which sought to improve the genetic quality of the human population. Sanger's support for birth control was not solely based on women's autonomy or public health. It was also influenced by a desire to limit reproduction among those she and other eugenicists of the era deemed unfit. She frequently collaborated with leading eugenicists and advocated for selective breeding policies under the guise of social betterment. While she rejected some of the more extreme eugenic ideas like compulsory sterilization, Sanger endorsed the belief that birth control could serve as a tool to prevent the procreation of the mentally defective and impoverished, reflecting a utilitarian view of human worth that has drawn considerable ethical criticism. Her writings and speeches often revealed a tension between compassion for the poor and a belief that reducing their numbers would benefit society. Today, Sanger remains a controversial figure, praised for her pioneering work in reproductive health care and simultaneously scrutinized for her association with a movement that promoted discriminatory and pseudoscientific ideologies. The language of policy. The language changed, but the intent often remained similar. Phrases like reproductive health and family planning replaced overt calls for population reduction, but the outcomes often disproportionately affected the world's poorest and most vulnerable communities. Politicians and prominent figures often rely on euphemisms as a rhetorical tool to soften or obscure harsh realities, making controversial or morally questionable actions more palatable to the public. Rather than saying civilian casualties, they may use terms like collateral damage to downplay the human cost of military operations. Economic hardships became market corrections. Government surveillance turns into data collection, and job outsourcing is reframed as global workforce optimization. These euphemisms are carefully crafted to minimize emotional impact, manipulate perception, and reduce public resistance by masking the true nature of policies and decisions. This strategic use of language serves not only to protect reputations and avoid accountability, but also to shape public consensus without triggering outrage. When a policy is described as enhanced interrogation instead of torture, or when social control measures are labeled safety protocols, the audience is psychologically distanced from the potential immorality or severity of what's actually occurring. Over time, the repetition of these softened terms erodes critical thinking and desensitizes the public, allowing abuses of power to go unchecked under a veneer of legitimacy. In essence, euphemisms function as linguistic camouflage, deliberately crafted to hide unsettling truths in plain sight. One of the most potent examples of euphemistic language can be found in discussions around family planning and women's empowerment. These terms, while seemingly progressive and compassionate on the surface, are often employed to reframe and legitimize far more complex and sometimes coercive population control policies. By casting restrictive measures in the light of personal freedom and public health, officials and institutions can implement sweeping controls over reproductive rights without triggering the backlash that more direct language might provoke. The shift from overt authoritarianism to sanitized rhetoric masks the underlying force behind certain policies, making them appear not only acceptable, but benevolent. Ties to Malthusian thinking. Malthusian paradigm and the issue of compulsion in family planning. To justify and promote coercive family planning measures, a range of arguments, both scientific and pseudoscientific, are typically presented. Foremost among these is the Malthusian, or more accurately, the Neo-Malthusian rationale. What sets this modern iteration apart is its use not merely to advocate voluntary population control, but to legitimize the strict state-enforced limitation of family size implemented through legal authority and backed by punitive measures of non-compliance. Modern implications. Today, philanthropic organizations and governments still promote population-related interventions, often in the name of health, equity, or development. But critics question, are these purely altruistic, or do they echo an older belief system about who should have children and how many? Bill Gates Sr.'s Planned Parenthood connection. Among his many philanthropic pursuits, Bill Gates Sr. served on the board of Planned Parenthood, an organization long positioned as a champion of reproductive health and women's rights. However, like many entities operating under the banner of public good, Planned Parenthood's history is entangled with the eugenics movement. Its founder, Margaret Sanger, openly advocated for population control measures aimed at reducing births among those seen unfit. Gates Sr.'s affiliation with the organization must be viewed in the light of this legacy. While framed publicly as a commitment to healthcare access and women's empowerment, Planned Parenthood's strategic language often masks more controversial undertones of social engineering and demographic targeting, particularly in marginalized communities. Gates Sr. broader philanthropic efforts, often channeled through foundations and elite circles, aligned with initiatives emphasizing sustainability, poverty reduction, and global health, terms frequently used in advanced policies of population management in the global south. These efforts were typically cloaked in humanitarian rhetoric, positioning population control as a moral imperative tied to environmental and economic stability. Yet when powerful figures support institutions with histories rooted in eugenics under the guise of empowerment and health, the line between altruism and agenda becomes dangerously blurred. Euphemisms such as reproductive justice and family planning become not merely linguistic choices, but instruments of ideological laundering, enabling coercive or selective programs to proceed largely unquestioned. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, while widely promoted as a blueprint for global progress, have faced growing criticism for advancing a universalist agenda that disproportionately reflects the values and interests of the global north. Critics argue that beneath the inclusive language of ending poverty, gender equality, and climate action lies a framework steeped in neoliberal ideology, one that prioritizes market-based solutions, technocratic governance, and international oversight over localized, culturally sensitive approaches. Rather than empowering communities on their own, the SDGs often impose top-down metrics and policy prescriptions that align with Western institutions, multinational corporations, and elite philanthropic foundations. This dynamic has led some to see the SDGs not merely as aspirational goals, but as instruments for entrenching global power imbalances under the guise of shared development. As such, the SDGs are increasingly viewed by skeptics as a mechanism for maintaining soft imperialism, where the language of sustainability and equity masks the deeper agenda of control and uniformity. This isn't about secret plans, it's about patterns. And whether old ideologies are still shaping today's global agenda, history doesn't whisper, it echoes. The question is, are we listening? If this challenged your thinking, consider sharing it. And let me know in the comments what part surprised you the most. I'll see you later.